Hey everybody, welcome back to Tim Travels. It's Terry, your host. It is July 1st, 160 years after the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. So I'm going to get right into it, and then we'll talk about a little bit of changes that may impact truckers. So there's a million things to talk about day one at the Battle of Gettysburg, but I mentioned, this idea that the South had better generals, but I want to, and I'm not really going to cherry pick here because I want to focus on, leadership in general. But the first thing that, one of the things that has always interested me about the battle at Gettysburg was, what was Lee thinking? And as I mentioned, I feel like Lee might have been suffering from congestive heart failure, but during the battle and during the campaign. But Lee had a lot of belief in his army to the point of not being willing to acknowledge that it was possible to lose a battle to the Army of the Potomac. But it should be kept in mind that, at Antietam, what saved the Army of Northern Virginia was two things: bad generalship and leadership by Ambrose P. Burnside, who was, Burnside's bridge at Antietam is named after him. But Burnside did not press the attack on that bridge as he should have. And that failure to take that bridge earlier and also ford Antietam Creek, as they could have done up the creek a little bit, allowed time for A.P. Hill's division to march from Harper's Ferry and get on the field in time to save the Confederates from being overwhelmed and really, really badly beaten at Antietam. As it was kind of seen as a Union victory, but it was incomplete. But Lee would have lost there big time, more than he did had A.P. Hill not been given the time to get there. A.P. Hill's troops marched a long way very quickly, so credit to them, but Burnside made that possible by bad generalship and not getting his troops across Antietam Creek quickly enough. So, at Chancellorsville, so Antietam's in September of 1862. Chancellorsville, May of 1863, Lee is fortunate because he is able to divide his army, and Union commanders not doing what they probably should have done allows him to get a sound victory at Chancellorsville, although he loses one of his corps commanders when Jackson is killed while reconnoitering lines. Now, I will say that Oliver O. Howard's 11th Corps is basically rolled up at Chancellorsville by the Confederates because of just failure of basic soldiering techniques, like putting out pickets and putting people on watch. His corps, the 11th Corps, is hammered at Chancellorsville by the Confederates because they just acted like, it was dinner time and they could just stop what they were doing, even though they were, in the middle of a battle. They just thought, oh, the fighting's over for today, so let's have dinner. It was a horrible, lack of leadership and foresight. Again, Lee gets lucky in a way that there's some bad Union generalship that's making up for errors that the Confederates make. But what happened at Gettysburg, it kind of, you know, like Gettysburg is called the turning of the tide of the Civil War. Part of it is because of bad generalship from the Confederates. So let's go back. It's 5 a.m. on the morning of July 1st. Now, Lee has already issued an order. Remember I told you yesterday, Meade had issued an order to get all of his troops to Gettysburg, to converge on Gettysburg. Lee had issued an order saying, I do not want a general engagement at Gettysburg, meaning a full-blown battle. Henry Heth, the Major General, he kind of like disregards that order and certainly doesn't, you know, consider the possibilities of triggering a huge battle. So they decide to conduct a reconnaissance in force, go back into town, because remember, Pettigrew's brigade wanted to try to find some shoes to steal. So that morning of July 1st, they're like, okay, let's go up there to Gettysburg from Cashtown, and we'll just march in there and get some shoes, and we'll run off any Yankees that we find. Now, they still did think that maybe they were just going to face some Pennsylvania militiamen. But as they get closer, they realize, okay, we have Union cavalry is in town. Now, normally cavalry is no match for infantry, but the fortunate thing for the Union was that one of its best cavalry commanders in Brigadier General John Buford had his division in Gettysburg, and Buford knew where the Confederates were, unlike Stuart, the Confederate cavalry commander, not knowing where all the Union units were. Buford knew exactly what was going on. So what Buford did was take advantage of the terrain, and if you've ever been to Gettysburg, it's a massive, massive battlefield. It's probably, I don't know if it's the biggest Civil War battlefield, but it probably is, because I've been to other battlefields. This is a massive battlefield. And so one of the things that you'll notice if you go there and pay attention to the terrain, which is super important to understand why things happened, Gettysburg, so South Mountain, which is really just a very steep and high ridge, runs for dozens and dozens of miles through Pennsylvania down into Maryland. And it's about equidistant between Gettysburg and Chambersburg, okay? So the Confederates had crossed over South Mountain and they're in Cashtown. So they're basically in a valley. But between South Mountain and the town of Gettysburg, there are really three, well, there are more than three, but three that matter for our discussion, ridges that run essentially north and south, okay? And those ridges aren't as high as South Mountain, but they're up and down, right? If you drive west out of Gettysburg, you're up and down, up and down, up and down, and then climb really up, come down, and now you're on the west side towards Chambersburg. The first ridge is called Hers Ridge. The second ridge is called McPherson's Ridge. And then the third ridge is called Seminary Ridge. Now, some of you might be like, well, wait a minute. I thought the Confederates launched Pickett's charge on day 3 from Seminary Ridge. And you would be right, they did. But those three ridges, what Buford decides to do, he already knows that Union forces are converging on Gettysburg. What he wants to do is keep the Confederates at bay as long as possible. So he deploys his troops dismounted, right? They dismount their horses and they get on the ground like infantrymen. And he deploys them in such a way that they can use their superior rate of firepower to slow the Confederates down who are coming down the Chambersburg Pike. And they're really on both sides of the pike. The pike is still there. It's actually US Route 30. It's just not dirt anymore. And it looks a lot like it did then. There are probably more buildings on it, and it's not quite as obvious about the farms that are there, but it's basically the same road. And so they have to cross 3 ridges to get in town: hers, McPherson's, and Seminary, to get into Gettysburg proper. Because the seminary, by the way, the Lutheran Theological Seminary, it was really kind of out of town at that time, right? It wasn't in the main little village. It was kind of outside of town. Now you wouldn't really know the difference because the town has grown. So Heth's troops are coming up the Chambersburg Pike, heading east on the Chambersburg Pike towards Gettysburg. Skirmishers are out from the cavalry division of Buford. But the reason I said they were able to hold them up with superior firepower is because the cavalry troopers, unlike the infantrymen, did not have muskets. They had Spencer carbines and Sharps carbines. Now Spencers were repeating carbines, right? They were lever action carbines. The Sharps were breech loading, so you had to open the breech of the rifle, but those rifles, all of them, could be reloaded while laying down, while in the prone position. That allowed the cavalry troopers to stay low, get behind fence rails, fence posts, and continue to fire at a much higher rate. Like a Sharps breech-loading carbine had like 3 times the rate of fire of the standard musket that the Confederates would have been carrying, which were probably Springfield 1851 muskets. And you had to stand to reload a musket. So can you imagine that there's a guy behind a fence, you shoot at him, you don't get him, and he can fire 3 times as fast as you, and you got to now stand up to reload. You can understand the dilemma. So even though Buford was outnumbered at least 3-1 in that initial engagement, his guys really slow up the Confederates, and they retreat, and they're firing, and they're firing, and they retreat. So they get back to McPherson's Woods. Now by this time, right, you know, the noise of the battle is people can hear that there's a pretty large gunfight going on, right? Well, Major General John Reynolds of the Union First Corps, who was also commanding what is called the left wing of the Union Army, or the Army of the Potomac, he's down in a place called Two Taverns, which is south of Gettysburg. 2 taverns, still there. And the buildings are, I think both the buildings that were taverns back then are still there. And that's the road to Baltimore, right? It goes down through Littlestown, Maryland. It goes down to Baltimore. So Reynolds, with his headquarters company, he spurs ahead, and he basically gives an order to the First Corps and the Union 11th Corps of Oliver O. Howard, who's under Reynolds' command. Hey, let's get people moving forward, right? So they get cranking, quick time, right, towards Gettysburg. Reynolds spurs ahead. His headquarters staff, his adjutant staff, they're tearing down fences because the road that they were on does not really intersect the Chambersburg Pike until it gets right into downtown Gettysburg. So imagine, if you will, that there was a road that was, this is the Chambersburg Pike. Actually, maybe I make it this way. Yeah, this is the Chambersburg Pike. So Chambersburg is out this way. This is Gettysburg. And then the Baltimore Pike comes in and meets downtown. So what Reynolds does is he cuts the corner, right? He basically is like, hey, I'm a smart guy. That's almost a 90-degree angle. Let's cut the corner at the 45, the hypotenuse of the triangle. But in order to do that, they had to march cross lots. So what his adjutant staff and his headquarters company guys are doing, they're tearing down fences to make it easier. They're getting off their horses, because they would have all been mounted. They're getting off their horses and, you know, as they go, tearing down fences to make it easier for the infantry to just keep moving and not have to slow down and climb over fences, right? They do that all the way towards basically the area between Seminary and McPherson's Ridge. Reynolds gets up there, and by this, he starts seeing what's going on. By this time, Union troops have started to come up, right? Buford's guys do a great job. They hold these guys off. So now we're talking by around 8 o'clock in the morning. Reynolds has come up. The first brigades of the Union First Corps are coming up, right? And the First Division is there. And you may have I may have said this before, but the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division of the 1st Corps of the Army of the Potomac was the Iron Brigade, the famed Iron Brigade. Troops from Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana. The Iron Brigade gets up there, and by this time, right, like, there are generals and you know, everybody's coming up towards the front, and the Confederates think, oh, we're gonna, you know, we're gonna mass our forces and we're gonna get up against these cavalrymen who we outnumber 3 to 1. But what happens is Reynolds is encouraging these guys to get up as fast as they can and get down to what is, I believe, is Willoughby Run. And there's a hill that goes up to McPherson's Ridge from Willoughby Run, right? The water, the stream is down at the bottom. He's encouraging these troops to get up there, and, you know, these Southerners, these rebels are coming up, and they're thinking they're going to fight Union cavalry. What ends up happening is they realize quickly that who they're actually up against is the Union Brigade. Why? Because the Union Brigade wore the Hardy hat, not the kepi, not the blue kind of crushed down hat, but the Hardy hat, which was an Army issued hat from the 1850s that had a brim all the way around and was tall, and it was black, right? They were known as the Black Hats, and these guys were not a joke. They were not called the Iron Brigade for just to be nice. These guys were solid troops. The Iron Brigade totally checks the Confederate advance. The lines start forming, the infantry lines, and in the meantime, though, Reynolds is killed while he's going up and down encouraging the troops. He's killed, right? Gets hit by a bullet behind the ear. Knocks him off his horse. He probably wasn't killed by a sharpshooter, because it would have been unlikely that any Confederate sharpshooter could have been positioned to kill Reynolds where he fell. Probably just killed by a volley of bullets that were flying up the hill, and he was at the top of the ridge. Let's see. So, okay, so we're already 18 minutes into this. I'm gonna stop here, because just to review, there's a midday lull. Lee gets on the battlefield at 2:30, right? 14:30. He basically countermands his order to not have a general engagement at Gettysburg. The irony of that is that it's kind of academic at that point, right? Like, the game is on. Something interesting that does happen in that morning session of fighting is that a Confederate general is captured by one of those troops from Wisconsin, and he's taken back, and Abner Doubleday, the guy who invented baseball, he is the Union 1st Infantry Division commander, and he assumes command of the Union 1st Corps when General Reynolds is killed. Doubleday did a very solid job commanding the Union 1st Corps on the first day at Gettysburg. And when this Confederate general, whose name slips my mind, is brought back captured, he knows Doubleday, right, from the Army. And Doubleday's like, hey, I'm really glad to see you. I'm really glad you're here. And the Confederate who knew him is like, I am definitely not happy to see you, and I'm not happy to be here. But it was, you know, the kid who captured this general, I believe his name was Maloney, you know, teenage, early 20s Irish kid from Wisconsin. He is later killed. He's killed later on the 1st, but he does receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. So that's kind of where we stop, you know, when lunchtime happens and there's kind of a lull. There's tons of movement, lines are forming. So I'm going to come back with a different video, and I'm going to talk about the truck laws, safety stuff that's, so some new laws going into effect today, July 1st. So I'll come back with that.